The surprise for me is that this idea that assimilation is the path towards leadership is wrong. And to the contrary, what we're finding with an increasing amount of research is that authenticity is the path to leadership. Covering is downplaying a known disfavored identity. It means that the identity is known in your interaction with another person, but you make an effort to keep it from looming large in the interaction. So you put it in the background rather than the foreground. My journey on this really started with my own personal experience. So when I became a tenure-track professor at Yale Law School, a very friendly, well-meaning colleague of mine put his arm around me and said, you will do much better here, Kenji, if you are a homosexual professional than if you are a professional homosexual. And I knew exactly what he meant. He meant that I would do much better as a gay man who taught mainstream constitutional law subjects and just sort of happened to be gay, rather than as a gay man who taught gay rights subjects and who litigated gay rights cases and who wrote on gay rights subjects. And so my question was, I thought I was done sort of managing my sexual orientation. So why is it that I'm still experiencing this demand to assimilate, and how would I even analyze that, because I don't even have a word for what I'm being asked to do. So what I did in true academic fashion is to cast my net out onto the sociological waters, and the word that I pulled back up was this great term covering from the sociologist Irving Goffman's book Stigma, published in 1963, where he says covering is a dynamic in which individuals who are willing to admit that they have a stigma nonetheless make sure that it doesn't loom large in their interactions with other people. And that was a great aha moment for me, because I realized that this is what I was being asked to do. I was not being asked to pass as straight, but rather I was being asked to cover my sexual orientation so that I coded as gay but not too gay in a way that would be socially acceptable in that environment. I started to think about whether or not this was only me and my idiosyncratic experience, in which case it wouldn't really be worth pursuing as a piece of academic work, or whether it was something that cut across different groups. And so I started looking at the civil rights case law, because that's my specialty, to see if people were bringing claims. And what I found was that the case law was kind of bristling with these claims. So if you think about racial minorities, or you think about women, or individuals with disabilities, or religious minorities, all of them were involved in forms of covering. So specifically, under our case law, if you're fired for your skin color, obviously you're going to win your Title VII lawsuit, which is the federal statute that protects against employment discrimination. But if you're fired for wearing your hair in cornrows, or if you're fired for language practices as a national origin minority, or having a particular accent, then the outcome is going to be much less clear. Indeed, you're more likely than not to lose your lawsuit than to win it. By the end of my book, I get quite dispirited about the extent to which law is the solution to this, because the law is too blunt of an instrument to deal with most covering demands. So the shift towards cultural solutions, where we're thinking about how organizations of goodwill who want to be more equitable and want to be more inclusive could engage these strategies of helping people to uncover themselves. One thing that Gloria Steinem said that I'll always remember is that we didn't have a way of getting our arms around the phenomenon of sexual harassment until we coined the word sexual harassment. And I'm hoping that covering can be hammered into our vernacular in the same way. I developed 4 different axes about the ways in which individuals cover: appearance, affiliation, advocacy, and association. Appearance-based covering would involve circumstances where women downplayed their femininity in their self-presentation. For example, think of Margaret Thatcher, who went to a voice coach to lower her voice as a budding politician. Affiliation-based covering is how individuals manage their cultural affiliations in order to downplay forms of cultural affiliation that might not code as mainstream. Women downplay cultural attributes or associations in order to make sure that they code as more like men. A classic example of this would be women downplaying their childcare responsibilities so that they not be seen as less committed to work. Advocacy-based covering has to do with people muting their activism on behalf of a particular group. Oftentimes, women feel like they cannot advocate on behalf of women, either for individual women or for women's causes, lest they be seen as too feminist. And the fourth is association. Association-based covering for women would be instances in which women avoided other women, say in mentorship or sponsorship relationships. So a woman who said, I don't want to mentor, or a woman who said, I don't want to be mentored by another woman, lest this be seen as favoritism. Women are really in a unique situation because women are not only asked to cover, but they're often asked to reverse cover as well. And what I mean by the reverse covering demand is, on the one hand, be masculine enough to be respected as a worker, that's a covering demand, but on the other hand, be feminine enough so that we can still respect you as a woman. And so an example would be in a very famous Supreme Court case, an instance where a Big 8 accounting executive was told, walk more femininely, dress more femininely, and wear more makeup if you want to make partner here. Right? So in that instance, the man who was giving her that advice was not saying to her, you should be more like a man. But on the other hand, where she failed in the eyes of the partnership was not to simultaneously be feminine enough. This research that I'm doing with my colleague Christie Smith, who is a managing principal at Deloitte, is a project that essentially tries to give the concept of covering teeth.
I saw Kenji speak in 2006 on his book Covering: A Hidden Assault on Civil Rights. And at that moment, I immediately saw the parallels to the corporate setting. And more importantly, how talent issues were becoming ever more important to leaders. One thing that we heard resoundingly in our research is that individuals wanted to work their jobs and not their identity. That people were simply exhausted by having to hide some element of themselves. Kathy, can you tell us about your journey with covering or uncovering?
6 or 7 years ago, when my daughter was in first grade, she asked me, Mommy, why do you dye your hair? And as a therapist, I see adolescents, I see teenagers, and my first thought was, well, I can't appear older. I felt like my clients wouldn't be able to relate to me. I thought my interns would think that perhaps I was irrelevant. I had all of these stereotypes myself about why I couldn't let my hair be natural and white. I had been dyeing it for a long time. And so I let it grow out an inch, and I cut it all off and went into work. And what was amazing is that the kids were actually flabbergasted and so supportive, and they it took us to a different place in our work together to have them see me take a risk like that and show a part of myself that they hadn't seen before and really step in. I feel like I had a shift when I stepped into that place of uncovering, that I was able to make other subtle shifts and really step into my own power.
One of the premises for us doing this work was to start with language matters and equipping people with language. It's the language of covering. People understand it from the moment they're introduced to it, and I think that's the power of this work.
I am first generation in my family to college and a professional career. For people who are first generation, their inner dialogue isn't, I am first generation, therefore this is difficult. I think people just kind of have their heads down, are working, are doing the best they can with what they have, and they don't identify their challenges with being first generation. And that's a huge piece to overcome. And so if there are people who are already in the workforce, who have already overcome those challenges, who have already kind of figured out that part of the game, who raise their hand and say, I'm first gen, it creates that link for them. It allows them to say, oh, that's why this is hard.
How do you navigate the decision point in which you uncover?
So I just had to make this decision last Friday. My dad was diagnosed with a terminal illness, and I had to jump on a plane on Friday and be with him. And I had to cancel my whole day Friday, Monday, Tuesday. I just got back last night. And my admin started sending out messages saying, Teresa's canceling the meeting, sorry she can't make it, sorry, sorry, sorry. And I thought, you know what, I actually want people to know what I'm going through. So I sent a message broadly to a lot of people I work with and said, here's what I'm going through, I'm not gonna be connected. And I got all these messages back with people's own stories. And they said, oh, my mom is going through a difficult bout with cancer. My sister just died of kidney disease. All these things I didn't know about the people I work with that now I know, and I can be more empathic to them and know what they're going through. So it was kind of like I gave a little and I got a lot.
The breakthrough moment in this paradigm was when we started to hear straight white men looking at the paradigm and saying, finally, a diversity and inclusion formula or landscape in which I can see myself. I have to cover on the basis of coming from a working class background, or I have to cover based on the fact that I suffer from dyslexia, or I have to cover the fact that I suffer from clinical depression.
It fundamentally redefines the conversation around inclusion, and it's a comprehensive paradigm in which everyone sees themselves.
The thing that we found in our research that was fascinating was that we all have a desire for authenticity, and we have a desire for other people around us to be authentic. And so it should come as no surprise that an increasing amount of research has shown that executive presence or leadership, or however you want to capture that term of somebody that you look up to and someone you're going to follow, that we expect those individuals to be authentic, and we'll cease to follow them if we perceive them to be inauthentic.
So much in work we present, and in life, we present with our titles, what we do. I go to cocktail parties or to dinners with people I don't know, and the first question that they have for me is, so what do you do? And what we're trying to do with Uncovering is to get to what you all just talked about, which is the story of who you are, not what you do.
I think the storytelling is actually incredibly important in terms of forming connection and finding common ground rather than differences.
It gives us a framework to have a conversation. And the conversation allows us to change our behavior.
There's a mismatch of communication where the workplace is saying to the individual, we want you to conform, without realizing that you're much more likely to get an engaged workforce if you have a workforce that feels like it's not leaving part of itself at the door.
The impact to the individual is obvious, but the impact to the organization is extraordinary. When you see that stress is the key indicator to leaves of absence or to individuals having medical issues, that's a huge cost to the organization. And think about the ability for an organization to open up and allow for an environment where people can bring their authentic selves to work, the benefit of that to an organization.
From an institutional perspective, I run a large organization. And to me, it's really kind of a business imperative that we get this right and allow our people to come to work as their authentic selves, build trusted relationships, and we're going to be more effective in execution.
So you talked earlier about the power of Uncovering when it relates to mentorship or sponsorship. Talk a little bit more about either your direct experience with that or how you think it will be impactful.
So one of the things I like to do when I meet with someone that I don't know very well in a work context is get out of my office, sit in a more relaxed environment, and just start off by saying, tell me your story. And it's really interesting for me to see where they'll start and where they'll go. And then that allows me to ask more questions. And I find those dialogues really fascinating. And I'll tell mine too along the way, but I've learned a lot about people by just asking them to tell their story.
And it does, I think, create a very different type of connection where I think thinking of someone as a mentor or a sponsor can feel kind of cold and transactional. But when there is Uncovering, then I don't think of them just as mentor or sponsor, then I think of them as a friend, and that feels very different.
I feel with starting with leadership, telling their story, it allows me to build trust in them and then tell my story, and then we can relate and find common ground.
As a manager, I think that you can really do three things. The first is that you can role model authenticity by sharing your own story. Second, you can create safe spaces in which other people can tell their own stories. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, you can sustain or stoke your own curiosity. I think we all have a natural curiosity about people who are not like us. And I think that, in some ways, is the most precious resource that leaders can hold.
Woo-hoo.